The roll-up door rattled into the ceiling and stopped with a tire clank, and the widower felt his breath catch as if the air had been taken from him on purpose. He had expected the usual abandoned unit mess: collapsed boxes, a mattress, old furniture that smelled like storage dust and regret. Instead, the space behind the threshold looked staged, almost impossible, a wall of suitcases stacked from the concrete floor up to the corrugated metal ceiling. Each one different, each one closed, and each one pressed so tightly together that the unit seemed to hold its own cold breath. Hard shelves with chipped corners sat beside soft fabric rollers with frayed seams, a child's small case wedged between two oversized trunks, bright colors buried under dull ones like a timeline of strangers. The corridor outside was sunlit and ordinary, but inside the unit the light turned gray and thin, and the air carried that faint, stale coolness of things sealed away for years. He took a half step back, without meaning to, palm still resting on a handle, and checked the number stenciled above the door, as if the metal could be lying. It matched the receipt folded in his pocket. This was the unit he had bought. This mountain of silent journeys belonged to him now. He had not come here chasing a thrill. Not in the way the regular buyers did, the ones with trailers and practiced eyes who spoke in quick numbers. He came because his life had narrowed into a steady squeeze, and lately it felt like every week took something new. Since his wife died, the mornings belonged to routines he performed like careful rituals. 2 lunches packed, 2 permission slips signed, 2 small arguments settled before the school bell. The nights belonged to the same quiet math. Medication copays, the heating bill, the after-school program he needed so he could keep working late shifts. His son and daughter were old enough to understand that Dad was trying, but young enough to still believe effort could fix everything if it was strong enough. That belief was its own kind of weight. On the drive over, he had caught himself thinking about winter shoes and the car's last warning light, about how a single surprise expense could push them into the kind of spiral he did not have the energy to climb again. He had watched a few storage auction videos on his phone when the kids finally slept, not for entertainment, but for the method. People making lists, sorting piles, turning someone else's abandoned later into a few months of breathing room. He did not want a miracle. He wanted a small, clean chance to steady the ground under his children's feet. The auction that morning had been plain, almost boring, which was part of what made his decision feel reasonable at the time. The facility sat behind a chain-link fence, rows of blue doors stretching into the distance, wind skimming grit along the asphalt like a thin river. He signed the paperwork, listened to the rules, and kept his bidder number tucked in his hand like a secret. Unit after unit opened to predictable remains of strained lives, broken dressers, sagging boxes, old clothes that had lost their story. People bid fast on tools and new appliances, slow on anything that smelled like damp. When the auctioneer stopped at the door that would become his, the crowd's noise softened the way it does around something that doesn't fit. The seal snapped, the door rose, and from a permitted doorway angle, everyone saw the same thing. Suitcases, stacked neatly, nothing else visible. A few regulars muttered that it looked like an airport's lost corner, and one man actually shook his head and stepped back. The starting bid was low, almost cautious, and the bidding itself climbed in reluctant steps, as if nobody wanted to be the person who took responsibility for whatever this was. He raised his hand with a calm he did not feel, forcing his brain to stay on numbers instead of nerves, and when the gavel finally dropped, he felt that strange hollow jolt that comes when you win something you are not yet sure you wanted. The manager reminded him of the deadline to clear the unit, the rule about not removing anything illegal, the suggestion to document before moving. He nodded through it, because nodding was easier than admitting his hands were trembling. Now, standing alone in the corridor with a borrowed dolly and a thermos of coffee that had gone lukewarm, he tried to approach the wall of luggage like a job instead of a mystery. He chose the closest suitcase, a maroon hardshell roller with a cracked corner, and dragged it into the brighter strip of light near the doorway. It was heavier than a bag of clothes should have been, and the weight made his shoulders tighten. The latches clicked open with a clean, practiced sound that didn't match the battered exterior, and when he lifted the lid, he found an ordinary, neatly folded wardrobe. Jeans, a sweater, a jacket with worn cuffs, shoes wrapped in grocery bags, a small toiletry kit zipped shut. The ordinariness should have calmed him, but one detail stood out so sharply it made his stomach dip. There was no identification anywhere, no luggage tag, no taped address card, no airline sticker half peeled from a corner. Even the inside label looked cut away, edges too clean to be accident. He opened a second suitcase, a bright blue softshell, and found a man's clothes rolled tight, a charger, travel bottles, again stripped of anything that could name a person. He pulled out a child's case next, small enough that his daughter might like the pattern, and inside was a stuffed animal with one button I'm missing, tiny socks, light-up sneakers that still held the curve of a child's foot. Again, no name. The pattern settled over him like cold dust. Somebody had not simply stored luggage here. Somebody had erased people from their own belongings. He forced himself to pause, step back, and breathe, because panic would only make him careless. Careless was a luxury he could not afford with 2 kids depending on him to stay steady. He took out his phone and began recording a slow sweep of the unit, quietly naming what he saw the way he had once heard a careful reseller do. Suitcase stacks, colors, sizes. No boxes visible, no furniture. Floor clean. It felt foolish for a second, then it felt smart, because the camera gave him a thin line of control. As he recorded, he remembered how those late-night videos always ended with the same gentle insistence. Tap like, subscribe, leave a comment, stay for the next reveal, and he almost laughed at the thought of it because his life was not a channel, and he was not performing. Still, the habit of community mattered. He thought of the quiet advice sections under those videos, strangers telling strangers what to do when something fell off, and he imagined himself later, after the kids were asleep, leaving a short comment somewhere. Document everything. Don't rush. The idea that he might ask other people for wisdom did not make him weaker. It made him a father who wanted to do this right. When he reached into the next suitcase, a black fabric roller with a broken handle, he expected more clothing, more blankness, more of the same unsettling absence. Instead, beneath a layer of folded sweaters, his fingers brushed something cool and heavy inside a small travel pouch. He pulled it free carefully, the zipper resisting slightly as if it had not been opened in a long time, and a soft glint caught the light at the edge of the doorway. Gold, not bright and costume-like, but warm and dense, the kind that doesn't need a shout to be valuable. The bracelet settled into his palm with a weight that made his pulse jump, and for a moment he forgot to breathe, because this wasn't just luggage anymore. This was money. This was somebody's real life, packed away and stripped of its name. He stared at the bracelet, then at the towering wall of suitcases behind it, and a single question rose louder than the storage corridor silence. If one bag held something like this, what was buried in the other 39? And why had the person who built this wall never come back for any of it? The widower did not carry the bracelet home like a trophy, and he did not slide it into his pocket, with a grin the way the loud auction videos sometimes showed. He wrapped it in the travel pouch again, then in a clean shop rag from his glove compartment, and set it inside a hard plastic lunch container he used for the kids' snacks, as if a second layer of ordinary plastic could make an extraordinary thing less dangerous. The storage corridor felt narrower on the walk back to his car, the air louder with small sounds he'd ignored before, metal doors banging in distant rows, a radio playing behind the office window, the faint roll of a cart over cracked concrete. In the driver's seat, he sat for a full minute with both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at the fence and the dusty road beyond it, forcing his breathing to slow. He could already feel his mind trying to do what it always did when panic threatened. Convert emotion into math. One bracelet could mean a few hundred, maybe more. A few hundred could cover groceries and a utility bill. A few bills could buy time. But the other part, his mind, the part that kept his children safe, would not let the numbers settle. The suitcases were stripped of names on purpose. The unit was clean on purpose. The wall of luggage was built by someone patient. That kind of intention was never harmless. When he finally started the car, he drove a slow loop around the block before heading home. Not because he saw anyone following, but because he wanted to be sure he was not carrying a storm into the driveway where his kids waited with backpacks and winter coats. At home, the afternoon moved in familiar steps that usually calmed him. Homework spread across the table, a frozen dinner heated because there was no time for anything else, the quick check of the calendar for school events he could not miss. Yet even while he nodded at his son's math problems and listened to his daughter describe a class project with bright seriousness, the storage unit stayed lodged behind his ribs like a cold coin. He waited until the kids were asleep and the house had settled into the quiet hum of the heater. Then he pulled the lunch container from the top shelf of the pantry and laid the pouch on the kitchen table beneath the warm light. He opened it again, just long enough to confirm it was real and still there, then closed it and reached for his phone. He did not search for how to sell gold first. He searched for storage auction found stolen property and what to do if you find valuables with no ID. Every answer came with the same 2 sharp edges. Legally, the unit was his now, but morally and practically, anything that looked tied to theft could drag him into questions he could not afford. He read slowly, as if the right sentence might offer a clean rule he could follow without regret. But the internet did what it always did. Offered possibilities, warnings, and stories from strangers who sounded confident until you noticed how often they contradicted each other. By morning, he made a decision that felt small but mattered. He would document everything before he moved a single suitcase out of that unit. He loaded the van with gloves, trash bags, painter's tape, a marker, and the old folding dolly that squeaked on turns. He told the kids he had a side job after school, which was not exactly a lie, and asked a neighbor he trusted to keep an eye out until he got back. At the facility, the manager nodded without interest, the way people do when they have seen hundreds of hopeful faces come and go. The widower rolled up the door again, and the wall of suitcases returned like a fixed stare. In the cooler shade of the unit, the smell was a mix of stale fabric and dry plastic, not moldy, not dirty, just sealed. He started with a wide-shot video from the doorway, then close-ups. Every stack, every zipper pull, every scuff corner, the bare concrete floor that looked swept. He taped a simple number on each suitcase he pulled forward, 1, 2, 3, so he could rebuild a wall if he needed to. He opened the first 3 quickly and found the same pattern. Folded clothes, travel toiletries, chargers without phones, shoes wrapped in grocery bags, and not a single receipt, boarding pass, name label, or photo. The absence felt louder than any object. Whoever had done this had not missed details by accident. They had removed them like someone cleaning fingerprints. Around the 6th suitcase, the find stopped being merely unsettling and became outright shocking. He unzipped the soft black roller and found, beneath a layer of sweaters, a velvet watch roll tucked into a side compartment as if it had been hidden in a hurry. Inside were 3 watches, each heavier than the cheap ones he bought himself over the years, each with metal that caught the thin light, with a quiet confidence. He did not know brands well enough to name them, but he knew craftsmanship when he felt it, and these felt like something a person saved for, wore to mark important days, passed down. In another suitcase, a floral case that held women's clothing and a scarf that still carried a faint hint of perfume, he found a small jewelry book with a snap closure. The pieces inside were not piles of glittering nonsense. They were precise and real-looking. Stud earrings that flashed clear under light, a chain that didn't bend like cheap plating, a ring with a stone set cleanly enough to make his throat tighten. He sat back on his heels on the cold concrete, suddenly aware of his own heartbeat and the way his hands were starting to shake. This was not one lucky bracelet. This was a pattern of valuables tucked into ordinary travel lives, then a race of identity and stacked like inventory. He thought of his children asleep in their beds, of how easily a parent's world could fall apart, and he hated the thought that some of these suitcases might belong to other families who had lost more than luggage. He took a short break outside the unit, forcing himself into the sunlight and the open air, and drank lukewarm coffee while he watched a couple in the far row load an old dresser into a pickup, like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. The ordinary scene steadied him and made him feel strangely lonely at the same time. He thought about the auction channels he had watched late at night, the ones that turned every find into a loud lesson, and he understood, suddenly, why so many people clung to them. Not because they loved greed, but because they loved hope with a process attached. If this ever became a story anyone else heard, the kind, practical listeners would do what they always did. Hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment with advice, not to flatter the teller, but to help the next person who stumbled into something complicated. The widower found himself wishing, briefly, for that chorus of steady voices right now. Instead, he did the next best thing. He called the one friend from work he trusted with real-life details, kept his voice quiet, and described only the facts. A unit full of suitcases, tags cut, valuables inside, no IDs anywhere. The friend didn't laugh. He just said, write everything down, don't rush, and don't take anything you don't have to take. That wasn't a solution, but it was the closest thing to one he'd heard yet. Back inside, he made himself work like a careful clerk rather than a frightened man. He sorted the contents of each suitcase into 3 categories: donate, keep for possible resale, and hold, the pile for anything valuable enough to change his month or dangerous enough to change his life. Clothing went into black bags, labeled by size and season. Shoes went into a separate bag, so they wouldn't smear dirt onto clean fabric. Anything personal, an old paperback with notes in the margins, a child stuffed toy, a scarf with smell that made his chest ache, went into a hold, but even if it had no dollar value, because those items felt like the last pieces of people who might still be searching. The more he opened, the more consistent the stripping became. Not even a scribbled name on a zipper tag, not even an address sticker half torn. It was so thorough that it began to feel less like theft and more like a system. He found small sewing kits and travel bottles, but no prescription labels. He found phone chargers, but no SIM cards, no contacts written on paper. He found a child's drawing folded into quarters, but the corner where a name would usually be written was torn clean away. He stared at that torn corner for a long moment, then tucked the drawing into the hold bin with a care that surprised him, as if he could preserve what was left simply by refusing to treat it like trash. Near the back of the wall, in a large hardshell case that took both hands to pull forward, he finally found something that changed the shape of the problem. Beneath a heavy coat and a pair of boots sat a zippered document pouch, the kind travelers keep passports and tickets in, and his stomach tightened as he opened it, because for the first time he expected to see names. He did find documents, but not in the way he hoped. There were boarding pass stubs with the name sections ripped off, luggage claim stickers without matching tags, photocopies of ID-sized rectangles where the faces had been cut out with a blade, leaving clean oval holes like missing eyes. Whoever had done this had not just removed labels from suitcases. They had scrubbed paper trails with the same practiced precision. The widower felt a slow, cold anger rise, not the hot kind that makes a person reckless, but the heavy kind that makes decisions feel urgent. This wasn't just unclaimed property, abandoned by forgetful renters. This looked like a deliberate attempt to make return impossible. He tucked the pouch into his hold bin and wrote a note on his inventory sheet. Documents altered, underlining it once, because he needed his future self to remember exactly when the line had moved. He was almost done for the day, almost ready to lock the unit and go pick up his children, when he noticed one suitcase that didn't match the others in a small but unmistakable way. It sat wedged deep in the back corner, a navy fabric roller with newer wheels and a handle that wasn't worn down. Its zipper pulls were different, too, cleaner, less scuffed, like it had arrived later than the rest. He pulled it forward and felt a strange resistance, not from the weight, but from a thin strip stuck beneath it, like tape pressed to the floor. He peeled the strip free and froze when he saw what it was, a small round tracking tag, the kind people stick in luggage so their phone can locate it. The little light blinked once, faint and stubborn, as if it had been waiting in the dark for movement. For a second his mind went blank with the simple, terrifying implication. If that tag still had power, then somewhere, maybe across town, maybe across the state, someone could be watching a signal wake up again. He looked from the blinking tag to the corridor outside the unit, suddenly aware how exposed the storage rows were, how easy it was for any car to roll by and pause, how normal it would look. He closed his fist around the tag, feeling the hard plastic bite into his palm, and realized he had a new problem that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with timing. If someone planted a tracker in one suitcase, then this wall of luggage was not only a secret left behind. It might be a secret someone still expected to retrieve, and the moment that light blinked, it might have told him exactly where to start looking. The widower stood in the doorway of the unit with a tiny tracker pinched in his fist, feeling the same cold focus he used to feel when his children ran toward a street without looking. He did not shout, and he did not sprint down the corridor like a man in a movie, because panic would not erase the fact that the little light had already blinked. Instead, he forced himself to think in simple, practical steps that a tired father could actually execute. He lowered the roll-up door until it was just above shoulder height, enough to block most of the wall luggage from view, then locked it with a second padlock. He kept in the van for job sites. Only after the metal bar clicked into place did he open his hand and look at the tag again, turning it over until he found the seam. He had seen these things on keyrings at the grocery store checkout, advertised as protection against loss, and he knew they were meant to be harmless. In his palm, in this context, it felt like a doorbell wired straight into someone else's pocket. He wrapped it in the shop rag again, then tucked it into an empty coffee can in the van center console, more out of instinct than science, as if dull metal and distance could buy him a little privacy. The shock of the day did not come as a shout. It came as a steady pressure, the awareness that he had just crossed from found valuables into someone might come looking. He did not drive home right away. He sat in the van at the far end of the lot, where he could see the office window and the main gate, and he watched the small movements of ordinary life until his breathing slowed. A contractor's truck rolled in, a woman with a stroller checked a lock. The manager stepped out to smoke and went back inside. No one looked at him twice, which was both comforting and unsettling, because it meant anyone could wait here without standing out. He called the school to confirm pickup times, then texted a neighbor to cover the after-school gap with a vague line about running late at a storage cleanout. After that, he did something he had learned during the long months after his wife died, when grief turned everything into fog. He wrote down what he knew before his mind could twist it. In a cheap notebook, he listed the unit number, the date, the wall of suitcases, the missing tags, the altered documents, the watches and jewelry, and now the tracker found under a newer bag. He wrote that the light blinked once when moved, and he wrote where he put it. A record would not solve the problem, but it would keep him from second-guessing himself later in a room where questions might come fast. Then he called a local non-emergency line. kept his voice steady, and asked what a person was supposed to do if they bought a storage unit and found evidence that property had been deliberately stripped of identification. The dispatcher did not treat him like a criminal, but she did not brush him off either. She told him not to sell anything yet, not to throw away documents, and to be ready to meet an officer at the station with photos, and the tag if possible. By the time he picked up his kids, the sun was already low and the day had the drained feel of a long shift. He kept a smile in place while they climbed into the van and talked over each other about homework and cafeteria drama, but his mind stayed split between their voices and the locked door across town. At home, he moved through dinner like a man carrying a glass of water across a rug. Careful, deliberate, refusing to spill fear into the room. He listened. He nodded. He laughed at the right moments, and when the kids finally brushed their teeth and disappeared into their beds, he went back to the kitchen table and laid out his notes. The tracker stayed sealed away. He did not show it to the children, and he did not say the word stolen out loud in the house, because he had learned that kids absorb more than you think from the tones you try to hide. Instead, he printed still frames from his phone video, wide shots of the suitcases, close-ups of blank tag loops, the altered document pouch with the cutout ID shapes, and slid the papers into a manila folder like he was building a case for his own sanity. Somewhere between the printer whirring in the house, settling into quiet, his grief surfaced in a way that surprised him. His wife had been the one who handled tricky phone calls, the one who knew which neighbor to trust, the one who could look at a problem and say, calmly, "We do one thing at a time." Sitting alone under the kitchen light, he missed that steadiness so sharply it felt physical. He still did one thing at a time anyway, because he had to. The next morning, he met an officer at the station, a plain building that smelled faintly of coffee and floor cleaner, and he kept the conversation simple. He explained the auction purchase, the wall of luggage, the lack of any identifying information, and the valuables found among ordinary clothes. He showed the printed photos and played a short clip of the unit from the doorway, careful not to dramatize, because the facts were strange enough. When he brought out the tracker, still wrapped, still treated like something that could bite, the officer's expression changed in a small, controlled way that told the widower he was no longer being treated as a curious bargain hunter. A second person came into the room, older, quieter, and asked a few practical questions. Had the tag been paired to his phone? Had he tried to disable it? Had he told the storage manager? The widower answered no, and not yet, because he did not want to make a wrong move out of pride. The older man nodded once and explained, in careful language, that tracking tags were not illegal by themselves, but in this situation, they suggested someone expected to locate an item later. He advised the widower to keep the unit locked and to stop sorting for now, not because the police wanted to take everything from him, but because disturbing the scene could erase details that mattered. There was a process for abandoned property, and there was a separate process for suspected stolen property. The second one moved slower and asked more questions. The widower left with a case number, a card, and a promise that someone would speak with the storage facility manager about access logs and any remembered details of the renter. If stories like this pull at you, it's usually because the tension is not about money, but about what an ordinary parent does when the world drops a complicated choice at their feet. People who follow these real-life turns tend to do one simple thing that helps more than they realize. They stick around, they hit like and subscribe so they don't lose the thread, and they leave a comment about what they would do in the same spot, because hearing other steady voices can feel like a hand on the shoulder when decisions get heavy. The widower did not have that chorus in his kitchen, but he did have something close to it now, a clear next step, and the small relief of being taken seriously. On the drive back from the station, the morning light looked too clean for how tangled the situation felt, and he found himself noticing ordinary details with strange intensity, the squeak of his wipers, the smell of his kid's shampoo on the back seat, the way his own hand stayed tight on the wheel. He wasn't chasing thrills. He was trying to keep his family safe without turning his life into a secret. At the facility, he spoke to the manager in the office with a calm that took effort. He told her he had concerns about the unit's contents and that he had contacted authorities, and he asked whether anyone besides staff had ever been granted access to delinquent units. The manager looked tired more than alarmed. The way someone looks when they realize their quiet job might brush against uglier parts of the world. She confirmed what he already suspected. The renter had paid cash for a long time, always late in the evening, always alone, and then stopped suddenly. She also admitted that staff sometimes did quick checks for pests or leaks in older sections, and that cameras covered the main lane, but not every row in the back. She was not hiding anything. She was simply describing the limits of a small business that assumed most people were ordinary until proven otherwise. The widower asked for copies of the auction paperwork, the delinquency timeline, and any notes tied to the account. and she printed what she could. He did not accuse her of moving suitcases, and he did not demand heroics because he needed her cooperation more than her fear. Before he left, he walked the perimeter of the row where his unit sat, noting how easy it would be for a car to pause at the far fence line without being seen from the office window. It wasn't paranoia to observe basic geography. It was parenting applied to a new kind of risk. That evening, while the kids watched a cartoon and ate popcorn too loudly, he took the tracker out of its coffee can hiding place and did what he should have done immediately. He put it into a metal cookie tin lined with aluminum foil, a makeshift barrier he had seen recommended online for people who traveled. It might not be perfect, but it was better than leaving the signal awake on his dashboard. He taped the lid shut, wrote the date and time on the tape, and placed it in the back of a closet behind winter coats, far from curious hands. Then he sat at the table and went through his photos again, slower this time, looking for details he had missed. He noticed how many suitcases were scuffed at the same corners, as if dragged off the same kind of conveyor. He noticed how the cut tag loops were clean, not torn, as if done with the same tool. He noticed, in the background of one shot, a small strip of bright airline baggage tape stuck to a zipper seam. The barcode tore away, but the color pattern still visible. These were not treasures. They were breadcrumbs left after someone tried hard to sweep the floor. He felt sick thinking about the original owners, but he also felt something steadier rising under the nausea. This was no longer his to flip. This was something he had to carry carefully until it was resolved, because the cost of rushing would not be measured only in dollars. The third day brought the moment that finally made his skin go cold in a way paperwork never could. He came home from school pickup to find his front porch light off, even though he always left it on in the winter afternoons, a small habit that helped the house feel welcoming for the kids. He told himself it was a burnt bulb and reached for his keys, then saw the object on the doormat. It was not a threatening note with dramatic words. It was worse because it was simple, a plain luggage tag loop, the plastic kind that usually holds a paper ID insert, cut cleanly in half and laid on his mat like a reminder. No message, no name, just the silent implication that someone else understood the language of cut tags, as well as he did now. He looked up and down the street and saw only the usual: a dog barking behind a fence, a neighbor carrying groceries, a car passing without slowing. The world, as always, looked normal from the outside. He picked up the half loop with 2 fingers, carried it inside, and locked the door behind him with a deliberate click, already knowing the question that would drive the next part of his story. If someone could leave that on his mat without being seen, then they were close enough to watch him. And if they were watching him, then the blinking tracker he found in the unit was not an accident. It was a leash that had just been tugged. The widower did not tell himself it was nothing, because he had learned the hard way that denial never paid a bill and never protected a child. He picked up the cut luggage loop from a mat and treated it like evidence, sliding it into a zip bag from the kitchen drawer before his kids came home and noticed his face. The afternoon routine still had to happen in its familiar order: snacks, backpacks emptied, questions answered. Yet every small sound in the house seemed sharper than it should have been. When the kids ran upstairs to argue about a game, he stepped into the pantry, called the number on the officer's card, and reported the half loop with calm, clipped sentences. He expected to be told to relax, to stop spiraling, but the voice on the other end grew more careful, not less. Within an hour, a patrol officer stood in his living room while the daylight faded, looking at the cut plastic and the photos on his phone from inside the unit. The officer did not make big promises or dramatic claims. He said the same practical things a good parent would say. Document everything. Keep your schedule predictable for the kids. Don't go back to unit alone, and don't try to teach someone a lesson. He asked about cameras, and the widower admitted he had none, because spare money went to groceries, not gadgets. The officer nodded, then suggested a simple doorbell camera and a cheap motion light, not as a fortress, but as a signal that the house was no longer easy to approach unseen. Before leaving, he walked the perimeter of the porch and driveway like he was checking a crime scene, then paused by the sidewalk and pointed at the spot where footprints would vanish into ordinary street dust. People like this count on you feeling isolated, he said, voice low enough that it felt like a private warning. Your job is to stay boring and stay alive. When the door shut and the house went quiet again, the widower realized how exhausted fear could make a person without even raising its voice. The next day brought the first real shift in the case, the kind that didn't feel like a victory, but did feel like a door cracking open. A detective from Property Crimes met him in a small office that smelled of paper and stale coffee, listened to the story from the beginning, and asked the questions that mattered. How many locks had been changed? Who had seen the unit opened? whether the manager had ever mentioned a stolen key incident, whether he had moved any items out. The widower kept his answers clean, because he had done the work to keep them clean. He had photos, timestamps, and the note he wrote the day he found the tracker. The detective studied the images of cut tag loops, blank inserts, and the neat wall of mismatched suitcases, and his expression tightened in the same controlled way it had tightened for the officer the day before. He explained, without scare tactics, what the situation looked like from his side. A storage auction might transfer ownership, but it didn't magically wash away theft, and the deliberate removal of identifiers suggested there was a reason no one wanted these bags traced. At the same time, the presence of consumer trackers suggested someone expected to come back for something specific, not for 40 random suitcases. The detective didn't say ring or network like he was narrating a true crime show. He said pattern. And he said like someone who had learned to respect patterns because patterns often preceded harm. He asked the widower to do something that made his stomach drop. Return to the facility with him in a plainclothes unit. Not to open every suitcase, but to see whether the tracker was linked to an account that would react when it moved again. The widower hesitated, thinking of his kids' faces when they woke up, thinking of the half loop on the mat. The detective didn't push. He simply said, "We can't catch a ghost by staring at an empty room." That was the moment the widower understood the trade he was being asked to make. He could lock his life down and wait for the next sign, or he could take a measured, supervised step that might end the waiting. They went that afternoon, not with sirens or a line of cruisers, but with quiet cars that looked like any other in a storage lot. The manager unlocked the gate with the bored motions of someone trying not to show nerves, and the widower felt a wave of guilt for dragging her workplace into his problem, even though he knew it wasn't a choice anymore. At Unit 27, the detective stayed behind a painted line on the concrete and had him open the door slowly, like they were both listening for the building to flinch. The wall of suitcases was exactly as he left it, dense and silent, the air cool enough that it raised goosebumps beneath his sleeves. He pointed out the newer suitcase where he found the tracker, and he described the blink of the little light as he lifted it, making sure the story stayed factual and not theatrical. The detective photographed everything, then asked him to do the one thing he hated. Pick up that newer suitcase again, just enough to trigger whatever network might be listening. The widower's hands were steady, but his stomach rolled as if his body understood the risk before his mind could. He lifted the bag 2 inches, held it, and then lowered it back. Nothing happened in the unit itself. No beeping, no alarm, no sudden footsteps. The detective's phone, however, buzzed a minute later with a short notification from an app he used for investigations. An automated ping that a nearby tracking signal had awakened and searched for connections. It wasn't proof of a person, but it was proof that something out there paid attention when this particular bag moved. The detective nodded once, then quietly instructed the team to settle in for a watch that could take hours. He asked the widower to leave, because a father with a tense jaw was easier to notice than 2 bored men leaning on a vending machine. The widower walked back to his van feeling sick with helplessness, and he drove away because staying would only turn him into a target inside the frame of someone else's plan. If you're the kind of person who keeps listening when a story stops being about what's inside and starts being about what happens next, you already know why this part matters. It's easy to cheer for jackpots, but it's harder and more human to stay with a parent who is trying to make the safest choice in a messy situation. If you want to see how this turns, it helps to stick close. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a quick comment about what you would do when found property starts acting like his eyes on it. That night, the widower cooked dinner with one hand and checked his phone with the other, waiting for a call that didn't come until after the kids were asleep and the sink was finally quiet. The detective's voice was calm, not triumphant. Someone had arrived at the facility right before closing in a dark sedan, parked where the cameras didn't get a clear plate, and walked the back row like a person pretending to be a renter. He didn't touch the widower's door, but he paused longer than normal by Unit 27, head angled as if listening for something, then left. The detective didn't claim certainty, but he didn't sound doubtful either. "He came when the signal woke," he said. "That's not an accident." The widower sat at the kitchen table with the phone pressed to his ear and felt the same cold anger he used to feel when a bill collector spoke too sharply. Except this time the anger wasn't about money. It was about the idea that a stranger might be willing to step near his life, near his kids, because of something hidden in someone else's suitcase. 2 days later the pressure came to a point, not with an explosion, but with the kind of small detail that makes your body react before your mind catches up. The widower returned from school drop-off to find his trash can tipped on its side, lid cracked, nothing stolen, just disturbed. It could have been a raccoon, and he knew that, but the timing sharpened the moment into a blade. He did not call the kid's school. He did not abandon work, and he did not start peeking through curtains all day because he remembered the officer's advice about staying boring. Instead, he installed a simple doorbell camera that afternoon, bolted a motion light over the garage, and put a new lock on the side gate with hands that didn't shake until he was done. He kept his kid's schedule steady and moved his own fear into the places it could be useful, double-checking doors, taking a different route to the grocery store, asking a neighbor to grab the mail if he was late. Then, at the detective's request, he agreed to one more controlled visit to the storage unit, this time with a goal that felt both practical and unbearable. The detective wanted him to open the newer suitcase under supervision and look deeper, because the tracker suggested one thing clearly. Someone cared less about the wall of luggage than about something inside a specific bag. If they could identify that something, they could understand the motive, and motive was often the key that unlocked the rest. Inside the unit, the widower knelt beside the newer suitcase while the detective in a uniform stood at the doorway, hands free, faces neutral, treating the moment like a procedure rather than a spectacle. The zipper rasped softly in the cool air. On top were ordinary travel items: a sweatshirt, cheap headphones, a paperback with its cover torn, all the harmless clutter that made the suitcase look like any other. Under those layers, however, the organization changed. A flat plastic folder lay against the bottom, the kind used for school papers, wrapped in a clear bag to keep out moisture. The widower lifted it and felt his throat tighten, because the folder was thick with documents that had no business being in a stranger's luggage. There were photocopies of passports with names blacked out, airline claim forms with barcodes neatly cut away, and a small stack of printed boarding passes that had been sliced so only the flight numbers and dates remained. It wasn't a pile of cash or a weapon or anything cinematic. It was worse in a quieter way, because it showed the work behind the theft. Someone had not just taken bags. Someone had taken the time to learn systems, to remove the parts that connected an object to a person, and to keep the remaining pieces like trophies or tools. The detective photographed each page, gloved hands turning them carefully, and he did not look at the widower with suspicion. He looked at him the way you look at a man who just realized his bargain purchase was sitting on top of someone else's sick routine. Then, at the very bottom of the folder, the widower found the thing that made his mouth go dry. A single sheet of paper with a short list of addresses, written in block letters, not many, each followed by a date. One of those addresses was his own, written correctly, with last week's date beside it. He did not speak right away. He simply stared at the ink until the letters blurred, because it felt impossible that his home could exist as a line item on someone else's list. The detective took the paper from his hands without drama, read it once, and exhaled slowly through his nose as if he was holding back the urge to swear. The uniform at the doorway shifted his stance, suddenly more alert, not aggressive, just ready. The widower's heart pounded in a steady, ugly rhythm that made his ears ring. It was one thing to suspect someone might be watching the unit. It was another thing to see proof that someone had been thinking about his front door as part of their plan. The detective told him, in the same measured tone as before, that this changed how they handled the next step. There would be patrol presence near the house, and there would be no more solo errands after dark, not for a while. The widower nodded because he had no better option than to cooperate, and because anger would not protect his kids. As they backed out of the unit and rolled the door down, he felt the air in the corridor turn thinner, like the building itself had absorbed a new fact. The wall of suitcases remained locked behind metal, silent as ever, but the story had moved beyond them. Now, the question wasn't only what was hidden inside those bags. It was why his address had been written down, and whether the person who wrote it planned to knock politely or come when the house was supposed to be empty. The widower did not sleep much after the paper with his address came out of that plastic folder, because a threat written in ink is louder than any shouted warning. He kept the house moving like normal anyway, the way parents learn to do when fear tries to hijack routine. Breakfast still happened, backpacks still got zipped, and the kids still argued over whose turn to feed the dog, but he tightened the quiet parts of the day like knots. He set the motion light to the most sensitive setting, checked the doorbell camera every time it pinged, and parked the van where it blocked a clean view of the front steps. When he drove, he varied routes without making a game, and he timed errands for daylight hours. The detective kept his promises in practical ways that didn't scare children. A patrol car rolling through the street once in the evening, an unmarked sedan idling 2 blocks over at school pickup, an officer who happened to be doing paperwork in the coffee shop across from the storage place. None of it felt heroic. It felt like adults quietly acknowledging that one man with 2 kids should not be asked to stand alone in front of someone else's mess. The widower also did the hardest part. He told the kids the truth without handing them the whole weight of it. He explained that the storage unit had become part of an investigation, that some people might try to bother them, and that their job was to stay close and speak up. He framed it the way a good parent frames a fire drill. Serious, calm, and clear. Then he moved on to homework and dinner as if normal life still had the right to exist. The kids asked questions, then accepted the answers with the strange resilience children have when they trust the adult in front of them, and that trust became the widower's anchor. Every time his thoughts tried to spiral into worst-case scenes, he forced himself back to the only real goal. Keep the kids safe, keep the story documented, and let trained people do what trained people were meant to do. The plan that formed over the next week was not about revenge or baiting danger. It was about closing a loop that had already started moving. The detective explained it in small steps, always returning to the same logic. The tracker meant someone expected to retrieve something, and the address list meant the retrieval method could involve intimidation rather than stealth. The solution, then, was to remove the advantage of surprise. They would not wait for the stranger to pick a random moment at the house, because that invited panic and mistakes. Instead, they would create a controlled moment in a controlled place, where the widower did not have to be the one answering the door. The storage facility became the obvious choice, because it was the center of the pattern, and it had rules that could be leveraged. The manager agreed to cooperate. Quietly and reluctantly, once law enforcement showed proper paperwork and explained the liability she'd been carrying without knowing it. Cameras were repositioned to cover blind spots. A fresh log was started for anyone who entered after hours, and the gate code history was pulled for the past month. The widower was asked to do one specific, uncomfortable job: return to unit once more, under supervision, and remove the tracking device from the suitcase, so the team could clone its signal into a decoy. That way, if someone came following the ping, they would come to a bag that held nothing but harmless filler and a tiny transmitter. The real documents, the address list, and the valuables already found were sealed as evidence and moved to a secure location, because the detective didn't want the widower carrying temptation and danger in the same pocket. It felt humiliating to hand over objects that could have changed his bank account overnight, but the humiliation was cleaner than fear. The widower signed chain of custody paperwork, photographed every item before it left his hands, and took quiet comfort in how procedural it all was. Procedures are what keep ordinary people from being swallowed by extraordinary situations, and he needed that structure the way he needed air. 2 evenings later, the moment arrived with the blandness of a weekday that didn't look important from the outside. The widower dropped the kids at a neighbor's house for a movie night, smiled like it was nothing, and then drove to the facility with an unmarked car trailing him at a distance that looked accidental. The detective told him to keep his body language tired, not alert, and that advice surprised him until he understood why. Predators and opportunists look for twitchy confidence, for someone guarding a secret. A man who looks worn out and ordinary is easier to approach. Under the harsh lot lights, he walked down the rows with a small cart, unlocked Unit 27, and rolled the door up while 2 plainclothes officers stood where they could see, but not be seen. The wall of suitcases still looked absurd, like a warehouse of stolen departures, and the widower had to fight the urge to stare at them like they were monsters. Instead, he performed the small choreography they had rehearsed. He shifted the newer suitcase to a spot that was visible from the corridor, tucked the decoy folder inside, and then left the unit open as if he had stepped away to fetch more boxes from the car. He did not linger. He did not pace. He simply walked to his van, set a flattened cardboard box on the cart, and waited with his hands in his pockets while his phone sat silent, not as a lifeline, but as a prop. Minutes stretched, and the widower learned a new kind of patience, the kind that feels like standing still on thin ice. A couple of renters came and went, nodding politely, unaware of the tight focus behind the quiet scene. The facility manager locked the office and drove out, right on schedule, leaving the rows emptier. Then, close to closing, a dark sedan slipped to the gate behind another car, tailgating the way drivers do when they don't want to stop and punch in a code. It moved slowly, took a turn too wide, and parked in a spot that gave the driver a clean view of the back row. The man who stepped out did not look like a villain. He looked like a person who had done this enough times to believe it was just work. He wore a hoodie, kept his head down, and walked with purpose rather than curiosity. He didn't check random doors. He headed straight for Unit 27, slowed when he saw the newer suitcase positioned near the front, and paused in that small, telling way people pause when they recognize a signal meant for them. The widower remained by his van, pretending to sort cardboard, forcing his hands not to clench. He felt the urge to shout, to announce that he knew, to demand an explanation for the address list, but he swallowed that urge because he wasn't here to win a conversation. He was here to end the risk. The man reached the unit, glanced inside, and stepped closer, eyes scanning for the exact bag. When he touched the suitcase handle, an officer appeared from behind a neighboring door. Calm and quick, identifying himself in a low voice. Another officer closed the distance from the opposite direction. The man's shoulders tightened, and for a half-second it looked like he might run, but there was nowhere to run that didn't funnel him directly into more hands. He lifted his palms, then lowered them again, as if he couldn't decide whether compliance was worth it. The officers did not wrestle him, and they did not shout. They moved the way professionals move when they want the end to be clean. One cuff clicked, then the other. The widower watched from 20 feet away and felt something in his chest unclench, so suddenly it almost hurt. The arrest did not feel like triumph. It felt like the moment a storm door finally latches after a long night of wind. What followed was less dramatic and more consequential, which is often how real endings happen. The detective met the widower in the office and explained what they could say now and what they still had to verify. The man in custody was linked to multiple theft reports and a small chain of handlers who bought luggage by the pallet, stripped identifiers, and sorted valuables before pushing the rest into resale streams. The wall of suitcases wasn't a memorial. It was inventory waiting for the next step that never came. The detective didn't claim they would find every owner, because the deliberate removal of tags made that nearly impossible, but he did say something that mattered. The paper with the widower's address wasn't a random threat. It was part of a recovery list, a way to track which buyers might discover valuables and which ones could be pressured into returning them quietly. The widower felt sick at how ordinary the motive was. Not a conspiracy, not a mystery cult, just greed with paperwork and patience. The detective also explained why the man had waited and watched. Once the storage unit went delinquent and came to auction, the operation lost control of it. The easiest way to recover valuables was to intimidate the new owner into meeting to talk, convincing him to hand over items in exchange for being left alone. The widower's motion light, doorbell camera, and quick call to law enforcement had interrupted that plan before it matured. The detective said, plainly, that the widower's cooperation likely prevented someone else on that list from being approached in a worse way. The words landed with a heavy kind of pride. Pride that did not feel celebratory, but did feel solid. Halfway through the cleanup, when paperwork threatened to swallow the human part of the story, the widower found himself thinking about why people stay with narratives like this. It is never only the money. It is the moment someone ordinary is forced to decide what kind of person they will be while their hands are shaking. If you've been listening this far, you already understand that pull. So take a second to stay connected. Like the video, subscribe for more stories told this way, and leave a comment about the choice you would make when an easy win starts to look like someone else's harm. The widower didn't read comments in that moment, but the idea of people thinking through the same moral puzzle made the world feel less cold. In the weeks that followed, he did what he always did. He handled what was in front of him one practical piece at a time. He met with the detective again to give a formal statement, and he handed over every photo and timestamp he had saved. He paid for a locksmith to rekey his home, even though law enforcement did not believe his keys had been copied, because peace of mind is worth more than pride. He kept the kids' routine steady and quietly arranged a few counseling sessions through a local program, not because the kids were broken, but because change and fear leave residue even when no one gets hurt. The storage facility allowed him to withdraw from the purchase under special circumstances, and the auction company refunded his bid once the unit became evidence. The money wasn't a reward. It was simply fairness, and fairness mattered to him more than spectacle. The detective also connected him with a victim's property task force that would handle donations and attempted returns, and the widower watched volunteers sort clothing into bins marked by size and season, turning the cold wall of luggage into tangible help for shelters and families who needed winter coats. It didn't erase the theft. It didn't restore the missing stories behind each suitcase, but it did stop the harm from multiplying further, and that was its own kind of mercy. When the case finally quieted and the patrol car stopped circling the block, the widower realized how much of his life had been lived in a forward lean. Since his spouse's death, he had been bracing for the next collapse. Another repair, another bill, another moment where the kids needed something he could barely provide. The storage unit offered a tempting fantasy. One lucky haul, and everything changes. Instead, it delivered a harsher, more useful truth. Some doors open onto responsibility, and the way you respond becomes part of what your children learn about the world. He did not tell the kids every detail. He didn't describe jewelry cases or cut tags or the way his own address looked on that paper. He told them the version that fit their age, that he found something that wasn't meant to be there, that he asked for help, and that sometimes the right choice is the one that makes you feel smaller in the moment but safer over time. He showed them what document everything looked like by making lists for groceries and budgets, turning anxiety into structure. He showed them what stay boring looked like by continuing to go to work, cook dinner, and laugh at small things. Over time, that steadiness did what luck never could. It rebuilt the sense of home as a place where doors were locked, yes, but not because the world was unbeatable, because the people inside were worth protecting. The future that unfolded for the widower wasn't a sudden mansion or a miracle bank deposit, and it was better that way. He took a modest promotion at work when it opened, not because the story made him brave, but because the case forced him to practice clear thinking under pressure, and clear thinking is valuable everywhere. He kept the doorbell camera, kept the motion light, and kept a habit of leaving a porch lamp on at dusk, not out of fear but out of preference for visibility. On weekends, he coached the kids' little league team again, something he had dropped after the funeral because grief had made even joy feel like work. The first practice back, he stood on the field with a bucket of balls in his hand, listening to kids laugh in the fading sun, and he felt something loosen that he hadn't realized was still clenched. He also learned to treat money as a tool rather than a savior. The refund from the auction went straight into a small emergency fund, and he built it slowly month by month, with the same patience he used to untangle the rest of his life. He never chased storage units again for thrills. If he ever went back, it was only to watch a public auction once, out of curiosity, and he left early because he recognized the look on new bidders' faces. They weren't buying contents. They were buying hope. He wished them well, and he wished them ordinary units full of nothing but furniture and forgotten dishes. In the end, the widower's moral wasn't that honesty always pays, because the world doesn't work like a clean fable. His moral was simpler and sturdier. You can't control what lands in your hands, but you can control what you build from it. A thief system had tried to turn strangers into faceless inventory, and almost turned a grieving father into a quiet accomplice through fear. Instead, he chose a slow path called Document, Cooperate, Protect, and that choice did something bigger than any payout. It kept his kids home from becoming a place where secrets lived under beds and panic lived behind curtains. It kept his own identity intact, the part that could look his children in the eyes without rehearsing lies. Months later, when one of the kids asked why he didn't just keep the good stuff, he answered without anger. He said that some money costs more than it's worth, and that piece is the kind of wealth people don't appreciate until it's gone. The kids didn't fully understand, but they nodded, and the widower knew the lesson would return to them later, when life tried to offer them shortcuts that came with shadows. Thank you for watching all the way to the end and carrying the story with him. From that first impossible wall of suitcases to the moment the danger finally snapped shut like a lock. If you enjoyed the way this unfolded, more heart than hype, please rate the story with a quick like, and tell us in the comments what you think the widower did right or wrong, and what you have done in his place. Your thoughts are part of what makes these stories feel less lonely, and if you want more like this, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one.